Well, I wanted to just briefly touch on Devil May Cry and how you worked on video games and some of that other stuff.
Yeah, no, I did all on that. Yeah. 28 days later.
The animals are contagious. The infection is in their blood and saliva. One bite. Stop! You've no idea!
For me, I think it's two things. One is you have a compulsion, which is not really very rational. You just have a compulsion to do a thing and follow through on it. And there's another thing, which is I just get interested in something. And then the longer I wrote, the longer it went on, the more guided I was by that interest. But in the case of 28, I remember I had been to a country that was suffering some very intense kinds of hardships. And when I went back to England, I was sort of frustrated in some ways by some of the complacency of the country. And I was thinking, bringing some of those hardships back home, I suppose. As well as that, not long before writing 28 Days Later, sort of dovetailing with that bit of traveling I was telling you about, there was a game on the PlayStation, Resident Evil. And what Resident Evil did was it reminded me how much I loved zombie movies, and I thought, I love those, but there hasn't been one for ages. And there was a thought there, I suppose. And there was another thought, which is after I got good at playing the game, I was thinking the zombies are not actually very scary because you can kill them quite easily, or you can get away from them with a brisk walk. But there was something else in the game, which were these dogs. And the dogs moved really quickly, and they actually would give me a jump sometimes. And I think that's the thing that gave the sort of idea of a zombie movie, but where the zombies move quickly.
Water. Are you okay?
The quick zombies, I think, really did come from playing Resident Evil. The rage virus aspect was, I can see this super clearly now. I can actually see it back in The Beach, where two characters are talking about one version of multiverse theory, which flows from space being infinite. So if space is infinite, there's an infinite amount of chances for something to happen, which means you will get a reproduction of whatever state you're in, except with some small differences and big differences and no differences, because if there's infinite chances, it just will happen. Basically what I'm saying is I'm a sort of science nerd, and that really took over my writing life at a certain point. In 28 days, I wasn't taken by the idea that the zombies were caused by something supernatural. Normally, zombies are dead people who've been resurrected. So they'll come out of graves, say, or out of morgues, and the dead are walking would be the sort of strap line, in effect, of a lot of zombie movies. That just didn't sort of push my buttons, and so I came up with like some completely bullshit idea about viruses and chimpanzees looking at violent imagery, or I don't know, it's just silly stuff.
Selena! Wait for me, please! Please!
Danny, as a director, I didn't realize this until I worked with more people. Danny's a very unneurotic director, so he's not threatened by writers. So Danny was like, okay, well, we're auditioning, so be there at 10 o'clock. And so I was sitting in on the auditions, then in pre-production and rehearsals, which was a really interesting thing to be part of, then on set, and then in the edit every week there was a new cut and we would be discussing it. And Danny is self-assured in the idea, I am directing this film, and he's not undermined or made neurotic by other people. I then learned that most directors are incredibly neurotic. And as the writer, when I said, okay, well, we're rehearsing tomorrow, they'd be like, what the fuck are you like? And really, really concerned as I just sort of marched in and said, so, okay, let's look at scene 13 or something like that. I didn't realize. Because I came from novels, I had a sort of atypical position where I arrived not believing in auteur theory. Auteur theory basically says the director is the author. But I was thinking, well, not really, because you didn't come up with the themes or the characters or what the characters are saying or why they're saying it, or, you might have notes, but that's not the same as creating it. So I never bought into the auteur thing. I think that was because of starting as a novelist.
Hello!
My wife had just done a job with Cillian, so I got to know him then. You know, we were all very young. In terms of walking through London, I think that is a really good example of then what a director does do. Because in the script, I think that was like 4 lines or something. It said, you know, Jim walks through empty London. I'm not even sure it said where. What Danny did was, as a director, then construct an entire sequence out of that for many people was actually the hook that made the film land. The strangeness. We're more familiar with that imagery now, I think. The strangeness of having a metropolis sort of emptied of people. It reminded me a little bit of when I was a schoolboy. If you ever went to school and you were there like an hour and a half after the end of the school day and everything was empty, it had this strange quality. It felt so different from the place you're in. And it was like the whole of London was an emptied out school, and it had this other strange element that post-apocalyptic movies have, which is they are in part a wish fulfillment. You know, they're bad, it's an apocalypse, you know, it's not ideal, but there's also something satisfying about them.
Execute Code Red.
It's probably nothing.
It was a good, really good object lesson in another part of the way cinema works. Good early lesson, which is the imperative for a sequel when something makes a lot of money. And to be honest, I think I'm sort of distant enough away from it now to be able to say this. I don't think anybody can get hurt, as it were. The difference between making something in a kind of enthusiastic, non-cynical way in comparison to a project that is generated by a different sort of imperative, which is there should be another one. 28 years later.
Try to think of something different. Oh, time keeps me from going lunatic.
It had been talked about on and off between Danny and Andrew, Peter Rice and myself. Those are director, producers and writer, respectively. I had, like, at some point, someone else had had a crack at writing a script, and I had a sort of really strange idea about Chinese special forces arriving in the UK and making a subtitled film. And then it really felt I had an idea that was honest in its intentions, and wrote it and showed it to Danny and the guys, and Danny said, yeah, okay, let's do this, and that was it.
Food, moving up and down again. There's no discharge in the wall.
It was really inventive. It's the kind of thing, yeah, that sort of rocks you back a bit because it makes you think, how did you put that idea together? Like, where did you get the idea to use that? It also had a very strange connection with the film that I'm currently releasing. This is not a sort of elegant or deliberate, cynical sort of drawing threads together of what I am essentially promoting, which is this film Warfare. What that bit of sound design is like it's an audio recording of a Kipling poem from like 1911 or something like that. Really interesting recording. When the trailer came out, I was really stunned by it. And I was talking about it with my son, who's in his early 20s. And he said, oh, you should know that spoken word. And I said, why? And he said, well, because the guy you're working with, the Navy SEAL, they use that the whole time. And I said, what are you talking about? They use that. So I then contacted Ray, who I made this film with, and he said, yeah, we use that for part of interrogation training. We play that at top volume for like 6 hours to people in cells to fuck with their heads. And so it had this strange life. Unexpected in the trailer, my son points out, and it turns out the Navy SEAL use it to destroy people's brains. Ex Machina. It's slightly misleading for me to say Ex Machina was the first bit of directing I did. And in fact, when I think of Ex Machina, I almost think, if you know about filmmaking, it's almost clearly not the first bit of directing in some complex sort of technical ways. And in truth, what happened, to be, I suppose, candid about it, a lot of time has passed. I ended up on some films essentially doing ghost directing. Something would be going wrong, or I would feel something was going wrong, and I saw the execution of scenes and I would be thinking, that's not really what that scene is. Like, it's missing this key component part, and it doesn't quite make sense to me without that key component part. I could also see that then when the film was released, people didn't care whether that key component part was in there or not, but I cared.
Do you want to be my friend?
Of course.
Will it be possible?
Why would it not be?
You learn about me, and I learn nothing about you. That's not a foundation on which friendships are based.
It came from a very long-running argument I'd been having with a friend of mine. When I say very long-running, I mean like it was at least 10 years. It was sort of about machine learning. It was about artificial intelligence. It was therefore about consciousness, as in human consciousness, or animal consciousness for that matter, but specifically human. And in a way, the argument was, are we understating the potential of AI, or are we overstating what human consciousness actually is? Just talking around it and around it and around it and around it for literally years. And Ex Machina kind of floated out of that.
If you knew the trouble I had getting an AI to read and duplicate facial expressions, you know how I cracked it?
I don't know how you did any of this.
There's a Reddit theory out there
Okay.
that Caleb Donnell's character is actually an android, and the whole movie is a Turing test where the audience is the judge of it.
No, there isn't. Although it's interesting because, there were various films I was super aware of. One of them was 2001, which has within it really a very, very good discussion of AI, but also Blade Runner. I made an assumption that a smart audience member at a certain point would say, I know what's going on here. Donald Gleason, Caleb, yeah. He's the AI. That's really what's happening. That's why there's a scene where he cuts himself open, because he then starts to ask himself that question. But he's not an AI. He's a person.
I told you you're wasting your time talking to her. However, you would not be wasting your time if you were dancing with her.
I remember one of the producers, Alon Reich, had seen Oscar Isaac in something and said, this guy is like seriously good. Casting is an art form, and it's complicated and nuanced, but there are elements of casting that sort of anybody could do. The key one is that you don't need to be a casting director, or you don't need to be a producer, or you don't need to be a director to know if someone's a good actor. The people who are really good actors, there is really a kind of consensus on it. And the example I've used when making this point in the past is Philip Seymour Hoffman. I've literally never heard anybody say that guy can't act. Ever, because he clearly can. Alicia, Donald, Oscar, and Sonoya, all of them clearly could act and just felt right. They all really understood what their roles were. They all really understood the film. They were also enthusiastic about the project, They weren't being strong-armed into it or bought into it. So that meant there was a good attitude on set. It felt completely right.
I also read that the plot is a loose adaptation of The Tempest. Is there weight to that?
That's absolutely not true. I'd like to say it was. That'd be pretty cool. Civil War.
I'm just saying.
Just what?
Well, you're American, okay?
Okay. What kind of American are you?
It came from populist politics and polarization, and an awareness, I'm left-wing personally, but an awareness that people on the left were simply not listening to people on the right. They were not listening to their fears and their complaints. They were just getting angry with them. And exactly the same was true on the other side. The complete absence of communication. I began to think, what could we agree on? Hence Texas and California being on the same side in the film, which then of course incensed lots of polarized people who felt their polarized state was offended, which is their what they like to be. Broadly speaking, people on the left and the right should agree that a fascist president who demands 3 terms and disbands the FBI and is oppressing their own citizens, that shouldn't be a left-right issue, that should be a we don't want this issue. It stemmed from just an increasing awareness of polarization and the consequences of it, and populism, which was not an American phenomenon by any means. Netanyahu's a populist leader. Boris Johnson in my country was populist. Actually they're everywhere. It's just that America has a position in the world that no other country has, so it felt like the right place to set it. So America had a civil war which was fought over a very clear issue in terms of slavery. It was really like apparent why that was being fought. Lots of other civil wars are really just, they're not exactly fought, well, they're certainly, many of them are not fought over a single issue. They are essentially a disintegration. What I felt I was seeing, amongst other things, was a disintegration. In fact, I still think I'm seeing a disintegration. A sort of disintegration of civility, disintegration of observing and believing in the function of democracy and believing in the function of the rule of law. You know, the famous thing about those who forget history doomed to repeat it, and it feels like elements of history are being repeated. And it felt like to make it over a single issue would actually be to make it easy in a way that was dishonest. The journalism element of Civil War came from something slightly different, which is that the populism is unfortunately fed in part by the media. And the media has also been demonized by the populists. And that is the same kind of unhealthy cycle that the left and right have got into. It's a kind of symbiotic state of self-destruction. And I was interested in what it is to present a narrative without a clear position, and instead rely on the audience to interpret and to think or converse or whatever it happens to be. Sound is just super important in film, and one of the really interesting things in film is that if you take a frame of film, you're likely seeing the work of composers and production designers and the director of photography and the actors and the writer, and it's this strange layered stack that also includes a sound designer. But in the moment of experiencing it, ideally you're not really thinking about any of those things. You may have a background awareness, like that sound, that's a pretty cool sound, or that's a beautiful piece of photography, or that's a good performance, but really you're not deconstructing it into these sort of, geological layers. If you work in film, you quickly learn how important sound design is. If you're ever scared in a horror film, hit the mute button, you will instantly not be scared. I have worked with the same sound designer now on every single film I've ever done or been part of. Very familiar with him, not just him, but his team. It's good to work with people who are really good, who will say, all right, step back, watch this, and then come back a few months later with a whole plan, and then you discuss it. There might be some refinements here and there, but basically you're seeing the work of a really good sound designer and their team. Civil War had some particular things it was doing, which may or may not be visible to people, but it was kind of taking its cues in terms of, actually often in terms of violence, but in terms of grammar, not so much from cinema and slightly more from documentaries and news footage. And that included, for example, when someone was shot, you didn't get, as it were, a big blood hit and a cable that then got painted out by VFX as they flew backwards across a room or whatever it happened to be. Instead, they would just collapse, and you might not see any blood for a little bit because it hasn't started leaking out of them yet. And the sound design had to fit that same aesthetic. There's ways you can make guns sound, and you will often hear guns in films sounding that way, where the sound of the gun actually has a few other things embedded within the sound, as it might be sub bass or something, to give it a different vibe, which isn't close to what you would hear if someone was shooting in close proximity to you. And we stripped all of that stuff out. The beach. My whole career has been unexpected and surprising to me. I was a backpacker. My whole life sort of revolved around backpacking for many years, really. I'd work to try and get some money, and the goal for the work, which would be, the typical sort of work that young people do, it was bar work or construction work. It was always with the intention of buying a plane ticket and getting a visa and going somewhere. So I did that for a long time and was sort of accumulating stories, I suppose. I also grew up around journalists. My dad was a cartoonist, but he worked on a newspaper. So I was surrounded by journalists. His friends were journalists, because the newspaper usually has one cartoonist or maybe two. So his buddies were journalists. A lot of them were foreign correspondents. And I had a hazy thought or hope that that's what I would become. But instead, the stories just coalesced into fiction and a book, a novel, and that was it. Suddenly, I had a potential career if I managed to follow it.
It was a beach, a lagoon, a tidal lagoon, sealed in by cliffs. And nobody can ever go there, ever.
Initially, it was just a book that had come out. It was there and it sort of existed somewhere in a bookstore if you looked for it hard enough, I suppose. And then I think it was, I'm going to guess it was about 6 months after it came out, I started to hear from the sort of backpacker community that I was part of, someone saying, hey, your book's being passed around in, Koh Samui or wherever it was, Koh Phangan, and it's like, and I'd be like, oh, wow. And then it became a book within the backpacker community, and they sort of brought it back, and then it suddenly exploded. It just turned into a bestseller, and I thought I'd be very pleased, and I suppose I was pleased in some ways, but I was really actually quite taken aback, because it felt like, by that point, something I wasn't really attached to, I think, like it had a life of its own. And then I learned that's actually what always happens with a project. It stops being yours as soon as you send it out, I guess, and then it becomes other people's.
And you, have you shown this map to anybody?
No.
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 Good.
I was a film fan, so I thought that was kind of cool. And also you have kind of hazy ideas of another sort, which is Hollywood. Like, oh, cool. That sort of reductively just that, oh, cool. Then, however, I saw what a film set was like, and I saw the atmosphere, but really what I saw is that film sets are collegiate. They're groups of people working together, and you write a book on your own. And I was immediately struck thinking, hang on a minute, I never planned to be a novelist. Like this, some novelists, as they were all really children, like 13 or 14, they were thinking, I want to be a novelist. That was not me at all. I thought, no, this is what I want to do. I want to be not on my own, but with a group of people working together. I had a deal for 2 more books, which was really based on the fact that the first book had sold well. And I spoke to my wife and said, this isn't for me. Are you cool with us taking a risk? And she said, yeah. And I paid the money back to the publishers, which they were very surprised about, I remember. Not as surprised as my agent at the time, who was mortified. Was really furious with me.
Mushroom, Richard. Oh, thank you, Daffy. I don't need any help to see the writing on the wall.
I had no say in that film. I had no input. To be honest, I was much, much less interested in the film as I was in the process of making the film. That was the thing that sort of struck me. I went to set in the pre-production period, so I didn't see any of the filming. It was just the teamwork. That's what I saw, was the teamwork. I just thought that, yes, this is what I want to do. Sunshine.
What is it?
It's the Icarus One.
It's impossible. It's been 7 years.
Clearly, it's not impossible because you can hear it with your own ears.
Are you saying they're still alive?
I was really interested in an idea which comes from one potential future for us, which is the heat death of the universe. That there's really nothing you can do to stop or alter the fact that we're all gonna die. That whatever future the human race has, we might get to Mars, we might get beyond Mars, we might even get to another solar system, or we could get to another galaxy. We could invent all sorts of things. We won't, but we might. But that wouldn't change anything. You still end up in exactly the same place, which is you and everything else. Your species and all other things die. And I was thinking, so if the sun was dying, which is our close proximity object that gives us life, and a mission was sent to sort of kickstart it back into life with some non-science. What if someone said, no, that's an act of cowardice, because what you're doing is you're taking the moment of the horror of extinction and you're saying, that's too scary for me to deal with. I don't want to deal with it. Instead, I'm effectively going to make my great to the power of whatever, 10 grandchildren. They're going to have to deal with it. I'm going to pass that horror on to descendants, which felt like a strange thing to do, and also is in a way parallel to the actual state we live in. And that just interested me and puzzled me. And then a sci-fi movie grew out of that.
Captain? Captain?
There was an idea that was implicit, which that space in the spaceship was supposed to represent, which is the sun is the thing that allows for life. So it has a godlike quality about it. It is also extremely hostile to us, not as an act of conscious hostility, but it's hostile in as much as that if there's one place you're not going to survive very long, it's going to be anywhere near the sun, right? The sort of dizzying qualities of that and somebody embracing the state of that just interested me, and how it would take the ship's kind of, psychologist essentially into a cosmic zone.
Do you have a process for making your characters feel different from each other or feel unique?
I did not at that point. So I think some difference would just arrive in some ways, but I wasn't very thoughtful about it. I didn't get thoughtful about it until the next project I did, which was an adaptation. It was called Never Let Me Go. It was an adaptation of a novel by a very brilliant British novelist called Kazuo Ishiguro, and I'd read the novel and I was lucky enough to have got to know that guy, and I called him up and said, will you let me adapt this into a film? What I was doing was adapting the work of a much, much more sophisticated writer. And I knew enough about writing at that point to be able to recognize the sophistication, like to see, oh, right, he's doing that. It was to do with the way themes and story were, and character were all meshed together. And I think what I did was sort of superglue those things together, kind of bolt them on in some kind of way. And he integrated them so they were sort of in a fluid kind of snake eating its tail way. They were just all interconnected. And that also related to characterization. I think it took a lesson from an older, better, more sophisticated writer where I was forced to confront what he was doing and I was not doing in order to learn about the size of the gap, really, and then think I should consciously try to get better. And then I wrote Dredd, which might seem like a surprise. Dredd.
Somewhere in this block are 2 judges. I want them dead. All clan, every level. Hunt the judges down.
You better move.
At this period, television was changing quite dramatically. And there were some very, very brilliant television shows that were changing the way television, film, drama was perceived. Really not just perceived, but also changing what it was. Best example, most famous example is probably The Sopranos. In a way, it began earlier than that, but Sopranos is such a perfect example of it. What television did, television and film is really very similar, and people who say it's not similar are more wrong than they are right. In TV, the writer-showrunner has the kind of authorship button handed to them. And in film, it's the director who has that. They can't both be true simultaneously. Television is not so different from film that suddenly, magically, it's the writer-showrunner and now it's magically the director. And some people I were working with, their principle was, well, why don't we take that concept from television and use it in film? For complicated reasons, that just didn't work. It created just a bloody mess. Within this is a disservice to Pete Travis, who's the credited director, who did some fundamental, crucial things, and he deserves that title. He was put in an absolutely impossible situation. Retrospectively, the longer I've worked, the more ridiculous I think it was.
How do you plead? Defense noted.
After the experience of making Dredd, what I said is, I am not doing that again. Just let me do that job. Let's simplify this. Annihilation.
A religious event, an extraterrestrial event, a higher dimension. We have many theories, few facts.
Scott Rudin, the producer, sent me that book. As I was reading it, what I was thinking is, I'm really enjoying this book, but I also have no idea how to adapt it. The act of reading this book is quite like, in some ways very like, having a dream where things are having a kind of consequential sense, but actually are also not having a consequential sense, and which is it, and when are they shifting from one into another, and where am I, and who is this person again, and that dream quality that everyone more or less is familiar with. I thought, well, that then is the key to adapting the book. I will make a dream of the book. I'll make an adaptation about the quality of experiencing the book, as opposed to the text of the book.
What is it?
I don't know.
When you do an adaptation, you really have to ask yourself, why am I doing this adaptation? Now, look, one answer to that might be I'm doing it because I'm being paid, right? That would be a completely legitimate response. But if that isn't the motivation, then what is it? Like, what is the thing that spoke to me here? And the thing that spoke to me was that intangible quality. How does one make something intangible in a medium, film, where at a certain point you have to pick up a camera and point it at something, and that thing is tangible because it's a constructed set, or it's an actor and they're speaking some lines or whatever. So how do you find the sort of odd gap? I then also I got hung up on another idea, which is sci-fi fan, and aliens often represented in books or in cinema or wherever. So often the aliens would have a human agenda. Now, the agenda might be to eat humans, so it doesn't have to be favorable to humans, but eating things is the kind of thing that humans do. Maybe they want to teach you about a galactic federation or like whatever, but it is aliens acting in the framework of humans. And in the rolling arguments with Ex Machina, one of the things that me and this guy used to talk about a lot was an essay, a famous essay called What It Is Like to Be a Bat, which is saying you don't know what it's like to be a bat, and you can't know what it's like to be a bat because a bat has bat consciousness, and you're not able to access the reality of what it would actually be like to be a bat. You can have a sort of imaginary version, but that isn't what it would really be like. It's about how hard it is to conceptualize a consciousness that is not your sort of consciousness. So then I started applying the what it is like to be a bat idea to Annihilation, and to try to conceptualize an alien that did not have any kind of human agenda. It wasn't interested in talking, or it may be that its mind, if that's the right word, worked at a completely different clock speed to us. Maybe it was much, much slower than our clock speed, which could mean it is only fleetingly or vaguely aware of us while we are in a space, or it's that kind of thing. So it was the idea of trying to create an alien. I sometimes think, in fact, Annihilation is probably a good example of this, that having started as a novelist has given me, in some ways, an advantage, and in some ways creates a problem in screenplays, because I can, in effect, make something work on the page. I can function like a novelist, so the reader is having that kind of visceral or emotional sort of response to the thing that they're reading. So that's useful, because it means I could get Annihilation financed, because it might feel a little bit like Predator, say, while you're reading it. You're thinking bunch of people in a jungle type thing with guns, aliens. It's a bit like Predator. So then the script, which is actually very, very strange, is hiding how strange it is because of the novel writing tricks. That is useful, although it can buy me into trouble in some respects. What's less useful is that I can also sort of trick myself, because I can make something work on a page as a writer that won't necessarily translate well to screen. The bear was like, there's something freaky, and a bunch of these people are tied to chairs by one of them appears to have gone mad, and then a bear that has the consciousness of another one that's died has walked into the room, and that bear is bad news. That's easier, though. Like, the ending was much harder to convey. Something weird happens was the description, probably. I think that was just a sort of act of faith on behalf of like everybody involved. It was a kind of act of faith. And sometimes you don't really discover that until the edit, oddly, because on the day you were shooting it, you just shot it because that's what it said on the page, so that's what we're here to do, so you just shoot it. And then in the edit, you think, hang on, that's just like bananas. And so I've been wrong-footed like that many times. Warfare. I don't know if you're familiar with Dogma, a school of film that made films with quite clear, strict rules. We had a Dogma-like rule on warfare, which was we weren't allowed to invent anything, and we were only allowed to try to recreate the memories of the people involved in this thing as accurately as possible, where we were able to believe in the memories because they were sufficiently corroborated by other memories. So it was really just an exercise in trying to be honest, and trying to be honest about the nature of a memory, just to say. Now, the sound then is part of that, which goes back to Civil War, and again, it's an extension of it. We had no music. Music would have been a kind of editorial manipulation of moments that would not have been appropriate for that Dogma rule. And also, sound was the subjective memory state, sort of built into the subjective memory state that we were trying to repeat and recreate. So, for example, you have the Ray Mendoza, who's the co-director, co-writer character in the film, who is in an IED explosion and he's wearing headphones. And those headphones are broadcasting chatter at him in reality constantly. But in his memory, he doesn't become aware of the chatter until he becomes aware he's being shot at and starts to drag his friend Elliot, played by Cosmo Jarvis, up a driveway back into the house.
This is profane. We're seeing activity converging to your north and south.
And at that point, suddenly the noise of the chatter becomes very dominant in his memory because it's overwhelming him slightly, and he can't get the headphones off because his helmet's on, and it's part of the chaos of the fog of war. Now, that becomes a significant part of sound design, but it is rooted in Ray's account of the state of shock he was in, partly concussive shock because he'd been in this massive explosion, and that concussion sort of scrambles people's minds, I suppose, is one way of putting it, but also the shock of seeing how badly injured, in fact, he thought his best friend was dead, and it froze him to the spot, and he simply had no awareness of noise or no awareness he was being shot at. So then the sound design just attempts to recreate exactly Ray's account of that moment.
Where are you guys?
Look for the blood and the smoke!
Multiple bad guys trying to get to our position.
Inbound! Inbound! Find cover!
My job on this film was very different to every other film I've worked on, and of course that's a lot to do with the fact that there was a co-writer and a co-director. Every other project I've worked on, actually, whether it's a book or a film, you're thinking about characters, you're thinking about scenes, and you're asking yourself questions like, would it be a good idea to have this moment in a story? Is this bit of dialogue or is this action a good thing, a positive thing to have? In this story, you never ask that question because it's all about verifiable information. And once it's verified, sufficiently verified, it has to be in the story. The person who is the ultimate keeper of that is Ray, my colleague in making this film. So he was, I mean, your question is essentially about the cast, is that right?
They felt like an actual unit to me.
And that's because Ray ultimately selected them and trained them. And his training method is actually a methodology to make them bond. I mean, it's to make them do all sorts of things like move across a room in the right way or handle a weapon in the right way. But really what it is, it's making them into a cohesive unit.
Yeah, it really comes across. It's very, very strong.
I'll tell him.
Please do.
Yeah. I'm privately very disappointed you didn't say Devs, which is a TV show.
Well, it's on my list. I haven't gotten there yet. I got Men and Devs down here as well.
Oh yeah, and Men. Shit, I forgot that one. Yikes.
Exactly.